Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm the Buddhist monks say it's okay to play video games, host Madelyn.
And I'm on my fourth stage of enlightenment, host Emma. How many are there in Buddhism?
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Talk This. It's a side quest. It's Emma's turn in the side quest cycle. Emma, what are we talking about this week?
This week, as I was surprised to learn, because I thought of this idea and then was like, we've surely done this, but we have not. So this week, we're talking about death in games.
Look for me doing birth in games in 4 weeks.
Doing what?
Birth.
Rebirth. Madelyn's finally playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth?
No, not yet. I should. I gotta start something new. My boyfriend has gone way down the animal well.
But yeah, despite it being like a very common, would you call this a verb? Is it a verb to die in games?
To die is an infinitive, but die is a verb. Yeah. Action,
no, I mean
sure.
Verb in terms of like action. In a game.
Occurrence.
Sure. But no, we've never talked about death as its own topic, despite it, like I said, being very overarching thing across many different games.
We've talked about many of the games that sort of come up when you Google video games about death. We just talked about Tales of Kenzera, which I assume was part of the inspiration for this. But we did an episode on Spiritfarer way back. I'm pretty sure we've done Greece. In fact, I'm sure we've done Greece because I remember us being like, how do you pronounce this?
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the Wikipedia page because in the rest it's Spiritfarer and Shadows of the Damned, which are the same in how they are about death.
Yes,
100%.
exactly.
So we've talked about a lot of games that are, about death, and certainly many, 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 many games that feature death, but never as a side quest topic.
Yeah. Yeah, so part of it is because we talked about Tales of Kenzera last week. I also recently finished 1,000 Times Resist and Nine Souls, which both have thoughts about death with, capitalized first letters.
Mm-hmm.
And also recently they revealed the new Life is Strange game where they're bringing back the protagonist from the first one. And I've just been sort of like reflecting on that game a little bit. And I was thinking, around the time that it came out, there was a lot of writing on like Kate. And in the second episode, she...
Spoilers for Life is Strange.
Yes, spoilers for the first Life is Strange. In the second episode, there's a character named Kate who will attempt suicide at the end. And I was just sort of thinking about, regardless of your thoughts on how Life is Strange handled that, and like the plot line and being sensitive to those issues, it's a little weird that like I could go and Google like a video game guide on how to stop Kate from killing herself. And then sort of thinking about some of the cavalier ways that games sort of treat death in general. And I thought it would be an interesting topic to discuss.
So the first philosophical question from Emma's notes for today: does Mario die when he misses a jump? Or is there a little cloud guy who's catching him?
I mean, I asked that question and then I was like, oh yeah, there's a live system literally in Mario that's like called that. So he must only die when he runs out of lives. Right? Like a cat. Or as Madelyn said, someone was a deal with the devil. Either or.
Because he still comes back. You just have to start over.
Yeah.
So think about that. Keep that in mind throughout this entire episode. What is the spiritual journey that Mario goes on?
It's a good question.
And did Luigi consent to this?
Uh, Luigi is busy vacuuming up ghosts. So.
Right. See, that's what's really alarming about this, like,
I know.
metaphysically.
Death does exist within the Mario world.
Maybe, unless ghosts are not dead, unless they're something else entirely. I don't know, man.
Horrifying. Anyway, the first article I read was like a 2010 piece on IGN from Michael Thompson that I feel like sort of colored the rest of my thoughts over this, and it just sort of pointed out that in games particularly, when death happens, a lot of the times it's just a way to say you failed at this, right? You messed up at this part, so you died, right? And now you have to start over. And a lot of games like present failure to you, perhaps because we have a lot of games that are about fighting in various senses. But a lot of games present failure to you as the death of your avatar. But it doesn't, a lot of games don't really punish you beyond like setting you back in your progress to littler and littler degrees as we've, modernized in games. So, there's not a lot of weight to it that you would think would be there when you're talking about something like death. It's like the game's using death as like a stand-in for like a little like swat on the head saying, no, you didn't kill the chainsaw guy fast enough,
It's a spray bottle.
Yeah. And I thought that was really interesting to think about, that a lot of death in video games is just like, oh, I didn't do the correct thing here.
I think my big, not problem with this article, but thing this article had me thinking was like, yes, true. Interesting observation, very right, that death is like very trivial in most games, and it's unusual when it's treated with more gravity or with more realism, or depicted in a way that is not like, I fell to my death. There's a thing around this also is the author of this piece, talks about like family members passing away and that experience, and obviously like, yeah, to like continue to go back to Mario, like Mario dies because he like lands on a monster or he plummets from the sky, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so sort of necessarily that's going to be a different depictive experience than any of the games that we'll talk about that are like about cancer or about mortality in a much more realistic or even drawn out way, perhaps. But I was sort of confronted with like, well, what's the alternative to some of these? Like, he talks a lot in this piece about modern warfare and like getting killed in that, or games like that, and it being kind of trivial. And like, yes.
Well,
but
my answer to that is maybe we shouldn't have games like Modern Warfare. I don't know.
Okay, like, sure. But any game wherein like the stakes are life and death, right? Which is just like, it's a creative medium, it's artistic medium. This is not just true in games. Like, we like the stakes to be life or death when we can in all of our media, not universally, but in certain types of stories and just in like sort of like the basic 101 of conflict, right? We want the conflict to be as high stakes as we can. And a lot of the time that means like there's the possibility of death. And so, again, this is not a criticism of the article. It just made me think of like, okay, so like games trivialize it, but like what else would we do? How else would we tell these stories where there is a failure state and the stakes are high enough without having to be like, they were permanently disfigured, or I don't know, coming up with some kind of like bizarre alternate fate almost as bad as death.
Yeah. Well, I think the main suggestions in the article was actually like designing more games without a failure state of a sort. I think, I don't really actually know a lot of contemporary opinions on this, but I think it's cool. I like, a good example is like the I think the 2008 Prince of Persia. When you fall or die in that game, your companion essentially just like grabs you and resets you or saves you. And this is actually built into the game later, where to find there's a whole bunch of fakes of her in a boss fight, and so to find the real one, you need to try and kill yourself, and she will come and save you, essentially. So, you know, there's, and that's not that different than just like cutting to black and resetting, right? But it doesn't actually include the death of it. So there's ways you can design this that are essentially the same as what happens, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean you have to die.
So, one, that's cool, and it's a cool way to avoid it. But two, it does set you up, just like that particular example, right? Does say, you know, Prince of Persia is like a platformer, right? And so, you know, in that game, you're more or less trying to, like, solve the jump puzzle. And you're right, that, like, especially for me as someone who doesn't love to have to replay large sections of games to, like, get good. Yeah, being put right where I was and getting to try the jump again seems appealing. But sensitive to the, like, okay, I'm a developer, though. Again, it's Mario. It's Mario again, right? Mario having Luigi pull him up helping hand from the jump doesn't reset him back to the beginning of the level the way that I might want if I'm Miyamoto. So it just, you know, whatever. Things can be harder, right? Things being harder for people and coming up with creative solutions is tricky. But at the same time, there's also just part of me that's like, if the outcome is functionally the same as your character going boop, 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 and then, you know, reappearing, respawning, I don't know. Like, what are
I
we
think
doing?
it's just something to overall reflect on in terms of the general state of games, right?
Sure.
It's not necessarily like I read this article and I'm like, yes, all death should be replaced with some other failure state, right? It's just that perhaps sometimes it doesn't need to be death, right?
Sure.
What is that really doing for the story, the characters, the feeling that the player is experiencing? And can you do that in some other way without, you know, fundamentally changing the sort of feeling that you want your game to get across?
Wow. I can't believe you've brought in cultural consultants here to say no more death in games.
Death is not woke. In fact, you are asleep, you know.
Yeah.
You're not awoke when you're dead.
That's wise. Thank you, Emma. Of course, the sort of omnipresence of death states in games, really dates back to the arcade era, right? So I read, you know, this appears in various things, but I read an interesting kind of academic article about death aesthetics. So I think like aesthetics, but death aesthetics.
Yeah.
From Stephen Curtis, Lancaster University English department. That talks about, you know, at first, right, we have this like coin operated arcade thing where the death is like a necessary function to continue churning money out of players, right? And then it's interesting that when we move from arcade to home consoles, suddenly these deaths that players have gotten used to, and also that are, you know, I think we've talked about this to some extent, this idea of, I talk about it all the time. I talk about it all the time on the show how I'm like, I love games because I can like solve challenges and they actually get solved, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, the death or the fail state in games is this important thing to... Players don't like it. He talks in this article. Players don't like it. They like games less if they beat the game without failing. They rate games consistently higher in studies if they fail a few times before they succeed, right? We don't want games to be too easy. We want them to challenge us. So, like, fail states, whatever they are a tool that you can use to create that. So when we move to home consoles, though, like, you no longer have the death is no longer serving this this necessary financial purpose. And it's also no longer serving this like very rigid, the player has to overcome this challenge purpose, right? So, you know, once we have this like press start to continue, some of that spray bottle in the face goes away. And so along with that, we see stuff like Resident Evil 4 and other games start to lean more into, okay, we see like a creative death or a gruesome death or a funny death or something like that. And then, of course, with stuff like Dark Souls later on, we move a little bit more back toward this arcade thing. But this time, instead of it being, you're going to put in more coins and that's how we're punishing you, we've instead made it sort of difficulty for difficulty's sake. That's overly trivializing of those games, of course. But like at the core of them, the death state there is encouraging you to like get good, right?
Yeah.
And back to closer to that original pure arcade state, just without the financial incentive.
Yeah, I think Resident Evil is a good example to look at in terms of like the spectacle of death, I guess. I didn't really look into like the ways that we as audience members react to like death in other media, because, you know, we're focusing on games, but, you know, we like schlocky horror movies, right? It's fun to see low effect deaths happen, right? We like B movies, all that sort of stuff. And that's like Resident Evil 4, for example. Like when Leon gets his head chopped off by a chainsaw, woohoo! Yay! It's fun in a way, right? Because it's just so over the top unrealistic, right? Which I think you know, that's why some more like realistic games, like the Tomb Raider reboot, that had really like horrifying death animations for Lara in a variety of different situations, got some pushback for that, right? Because in some ways that's less fun, right? I don't want to see Lara dying horribly in like, I think when I played it, she got like, I remember vividly her like rushing down a river and getting like skewered by a tree branch, right? And that's not as over the top schlocky as getting my head chopped off by a chainsaw by a zombie man, right? Like that's like, that could happen to me. I don't like that, you know? I don't want to see that.
Oh, but that, you know, there's a history of that sort of violence being enacted on female bodies in horror movies as well, of course.
Sure. But even stuff like The Last of Us, even. Stuff that's aiming for something more like realistic will often go for more realistic death animations when your character dies. And I think that is less, like, there's a distaste for that, at least a small amount, that isn't really for more over-the-top sort of animations.
You know, I mean, I think The Last of Us is an example that it's interesting, right? Because people have strong reactions to it, but also when you hear them talk about like what they're trying to do with this game, when you think about it as a game that is to some extent like a stealth-oriented game, I mean, it's a jump scare, right? Like deaths in The Last of Us are functionally jump scares, and they do that pretty well. Maybe they do it less well the like fifth time that it happens to you, but you know, definitely they achieve that purpose. So if you're seeing it as a horror movie to some extent, like it's very much in that genre world.
Just because you talked about the Death Cetics article, and I thought that it answered my question on this pretty well, just a detour away from like own player death, which we can continue talking about. But of course, in games, you can also have other characters die. But in sort of looking into it, beyond that one famous example, I didn't actually find that many games where like your party member dies. I think that, you know, that in terms of stories in general, I think there will be some death to find there. But specifically in terms of like a character that you control dies without your input, right? In terms of a linear story, right?
Sure,
It's
yes.
an unavoidable death.
You see it more in the Mass Effect Baldur's Gate choice-based
Yes.
situation, wherein, Walking Dead, that sort of thing. Certainly.
But in terms of having an unavoidable death, there wasn't really that much. Or it would come at, like, the end of the game, right? Where it wouldn't really have an impact on the player's journey through it. It's just, like, the conclusion of the story. Yeah. And I was wondering, like, feels like such an impactful thing that you can do. And I was thinking, like, well, maybe it's just tough, right? It's just a tough design thing to pull off in terms of taking a party member away from a player and balancing the rest of the game around that, and, so on and so forth. But there's this little cutaway in the Deathsetics article where they said, like, there's, like, players are so used to their own sort of catharsis of death and rebirth and feeling like there's some control over it, right, in games that isn't really in any other media. And so when players are faced with a sort of unavoidable death, they react in a more, like, frustrated, irritated way than they might if they were watching a TV show and somebody died, or a movie and somebody died. Which I thought was, like, an interesting point, that, like, the fact that you're dying so much as a player, but that just results in a reset, right? That's not, like, a permanent consequence necessarily in these games. And so when you're faced with a permanent consequence that doesn't have anything to do with your own actions, that can feel frustrating in comparison to your previous experience with death in the game, which I just thought was an interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, not to get all ludonarrative dissonance on this, but I have to imagine that is some part of, I mean, in addition to players just being big babies who don't want to...
Gamers. Let's not throw all players under the bus.
I'm sure that I would feel some of this way if I was actually playing a game as opposed to looking at something more academically. But... in other media, we're willing to be, like, sad or frustrated or work through difficult emotions. And in games, if our favorite toy is taken away from us, we throw the controller, right? So that's part of it. But I'm also sure there has to be some tension, and this came up in at least a few articles I read, between the mechanics of games such that you are often reviving party members, whether just, like, automatically at the end of a level or through copious spells, items, whatever, throughout battles, such that you are dying, lowercase d, dozens or hundreds of times, right? And having a permadeath that takes place in a story because, it's like, well, why didn't they just cast, like, Kiraga on her, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You've given characters powers for the purposes of gameplay that you don't necessarily want them to have when somebody actually dies.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a tricky balance, and not too many games try to take that on. And in fact, as I love to whine about all the time, games that do have permadeath for characters, notable one being Fire Emblem, right? Man, the stories of modern Fire Emblems really suffer for that, I think.
Yeah. I don't know if it's that different than it has ever been. But yeah, I do think it's notable that, like, despite Fire Emblem, even, like, the classic ones having permadeath baked into it, right? Back before they had casual mode. It's still, like, when you do a run where you let permadeath happen, that's the one that gets the special name, right? You're doing an Iron Man run of Fire Emblem. You're not just playing Fire Emblem.
No, it's crazy,
you're
right?
You're playing
the
it as intended.
It's built in, the meta is like, no.
Yeah.
Like, you reset. You're Mario here. Like, it doesn't matter. It's not that they want Mario to just die, but no. We're like, no. Mario's going back to the beginning of the level.
Yeah. But, like, it's kind of like a weird little morbid puzzle, sort of, sometimes with with Fire Emblem, and that's sort of the appeal of continuing to reset. But yeah, it is just sort of interesting that's like, oh, I'm using the mechanics as was probably originally intended, but that's like a special way to play it.
Yeah. I want to circle back to like deaths as creating satisfying moments to the players, or storytelling, or drama, or that kind of thing for a moment. Because I already like accidentally lightly shaded Dark Souls. But it was interesting to me. I read a New Yorker profile of Miyazaki, it's the creator, creative head, visionary, auteur, or whatever, behind Dark Souls. I had not read the story before of like how that happened for him. Kind of crazy that they were just like, here's a game that's going badly, and like nobody cared, and he made Demon Souls, and then he made Dark Souls, and it made a ton of money. Also crazy that he had a digital picture frame that circled through bad feedback that they got from playtesters. Just some wild little tidbits in that article. But he talks all the time in interviews about how like he's not very good at games, which I just think is a lie. Just has to be a blatant lie.
Perhaps comparatively.
Okay, sure. I just don't think that there's any way that he's not really good at Souls-likes. Like, sorry. If you're not good at it by now, like, that's weird.
I feel like I've heard, like, colloquially that they, like, give him bosses sometimes, and if he can beat it, they're like, okay.
So he talks in this, he says, I've never been a very skilled player. I die a lot. So in my work, I want to answer the question, if death is to be more than a mark of failure, how do I give it meaning? How do I make death enjoyable? And then later on, they say that for him, video game death is an opportunity to create a memory or a punchline. When I'm playing these games, I think this is the way I'd want to die, in a way that is amusing or interesting, or that creates a story that I can share. Death and rebirth, trying and overcoming, we want that cycle to be enjoyable. In life, death is a horrible thing. In play, it can be something else.
Yeah. Souls-likes are definitely one of the two major genres that are very aware of and playing with the player death. The other one being roguelikes, of course.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, of course, that in both of those games, and we'll talk more, I think, about, there's certain sort of indie genre of game where death is sort of like part of the progression, and like death-positive games, right? But in terms of mainstream genres, Souls-likes and roguelikes are perhaps the only games that want to upfront acknowledge that, like, you will die.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Action-adventure games, writ large, don't want to acknowledge that, like, Nathan Drake is going to die a few times.
Yeah.
And so because of that, like, it was notable to me, again, I have not ever played a From Software game myself. But it was interesting to me to read, because I wasn't really aware of this, that pretty much all of them have like an in-universe reason that you keep coming back.
Yeah.
That like makes sense with the themes of the game. And it's like, oh, good, of course. Like, you'd better, because you're going to be dying a lot, and if every time you die the player is thinking like, well, the Tarnish should just be dead now.
Yeah.
Like, that's not the experience. That's definitely not the thought you want them to have.
Yeah, I read a little blog post by Aaron Suduiko on With a Terrible Fate blog that was looking at the first Dark Souls, and that one too has like it almost feels like the game itself is a cycle, right? To kill the final boss and become the final boss, and then kill yourself as the final boss. Not that literally, but in a sort of like, as soon as you finish the game, you see New Game Plus, and you do it all over again, essentially. And like your final choice at the end is ultimately just another part of this cycle of light and darkness, or death and rebirth, in terms of the world as a whole, which is, of course, what you've been doing as a player the whole time. So, they've definitely thought through their themes. Like I said, I just finished Nine Souls, which is a Souls-like. And I think it's pretty common for these games to have some sort of explanation for why you are continuing to reset and reset. Nier Automata also has like light Souls-like elements in that you have to go retrieve your body to get your stuff, right? Because theoretically it's a physical body that you've left behind, and it's just your android consciousness that has been sent back into a new body. So any chips you had slotted in, you have to go get them. Just like in Souls, like, this isn't like universal, right? You don't drop your weaponry necessarily, right? You don't drop everything when you die. You just drop like whatever they've chosen to represent you, like your essence or whatever.
Well, it's a lot easier in sci-fi or fantasy games, certainly, where you have the opportunity to create some kind of wizard.
Yeah, sure.
Right? Like wizard or mainframe or whatever reason that like your character can keep coming back. Like I'm sympathetic to the challenge of I'm creating a game that is about something where there's no magic and the computers aren't supercomputers, and like, but also players expect that there's going to be some kind of a fail state.
Yeah.
And what do? Like, there's just nothing. There's no real way to justify it.
Yeah.
Unless you want to have your character say after every death, "Oh no, like, you're probably wondering how I ended up in this situation." And then I did it.
I think another Prince of Persia, Sands of Time, maybe, unless that's a 2001. But there is another Prince of Persia where when the prince dies, he's just like, "JK, I didn't."
So then I'll narrow it even further.
Assassin's
if you're trying to make
Creed.
a mad funny game, there's room.
Yeah.
There's jokes to be made.
Assassin's Creed will be like, oh, there's an error in the memory matrix.
Right. Yeah. But that's sci-fi. You got a computer.
Yeah. Or I think like Tales from the Borderlands, because they're technically narrating their story, both when they die and just like at other times they'll be like, "No, it didn't."
Yeah.
Stop.
Yeah. Like, that didn't happen.
A couple other examples of games sort of trying to justify your death and rebirth cycle that I thought of. Hellblade, I believe like she's in some sort of contract with a god or something. They imply to you that if you die enough, like this rot will travel up Senua's arm and will erase your save file eventually in like true death. I do not believe that's actually, like, that's just implied to you, right, to insert tension. I don't believe it's actually something that happens unless you like really suck, maybe. It's certainly not something that would happen to many players. When you play Shin Megami Tensei 4, when you die, you'll go to like, I think it's Karen, and if you pay him some money, he will reset you back to the living world because he's really busy, right? And he doesn't want to ferry everybody across. He's got like a big line. You can pay him in like in-game coins or the coins you get from like walking around with your 3DS, which is really funny. And then I was on Reddit looking at this, and someone was describing Final Fantasy II, where apparently whenever you die, you're like sent to Valhalla, and Odin like sends you back and is like, "But I'll kill you eventually, okay? I'll do it."
That's dope.
And then later in the game, you do in fact encounter Odin and must fight him. And then after you kill Odin, you no longer have like the continue option. You have to load your last save.
Oh, that's sick.
Apparently Final Fantasy II sucks, but that sounds sick to me. So
somebody should take that. That's dope. I feel like God of War could rip that direct.
Yeah. And then Alan Wake 2, the implication is that when you die, you're like starting another loop, right? Because they've got like this sort of loopy spiral thing going on in its narrative structure. And then some games do have like very hard permadeath modes if you really want to take death seriously. Like The Last of Us 2 added one. Baldur's Gate 3 has like honor mode where if you die, you die. And stuff like that. Those are sort of the main examples I found.
So all this to say, unless you're in a fantasy or sci-fi world where you can create an in-universe like resurrection, or you're willing to intentionally break immersion through narrators, or humor, or something like that in some capacity. If you're trying to make a semi-serious, semi-realistic, at least by movie standards, if you're trying to make a Hollywood action movie as a game, you're gonna have a hard time.
Unless you're making The Edge of Tomorrow. That's what the Tom Cruise movie is called, right?
That's sci-fi though, right? Like,
true, that's fair. You're right.
like, once sci-fi gets in the picture, all bets are off.
Yeah.
Absolutely. They uploaded their consciousness. There's a clone, whatever you want it to be.
But there's definitely stuff you can do, depending on the game that you're making. All games are fantasy or sci-fi anyway, so...
Fair enough.
Oh, I guess there's also, like, Sifu, right? Where you die.
There's something...
and you get older.
Right. So Sifu, though, is an interesting example of, like, death as sort of progression.
Yeah.
Which you actually don't see, you don't see a ton of outside of Hades-like roguelikes, I guess.
Is Sifu a roguelike, technically?
I think that you might be able to argue that Sifu is a Hades-like, yeah. A roguelite, I suppose, is the the category. Yeah, I think
upgrading is a little less straightforward in Sifu, I remember.
I think the fact that it doesn't change really, right, makes it more of a murky case.
Right.
But yeah, there are not very many games wherein, like, you are quote unquote rewarded for death, or death is necessary to progress. So it's interesting when you do see an example of it. I mean, for the most part, death is used in a just very capitalistic way, right? Going all the way back to its coin op origins in games, wherein at best you are penalized of your time, right? As we know, under capitalism, time is money.
Right. Games are labor.
Yes. Ian Bogost, are you listening? No, he's too busy talking about carry-on luggage. Which he has a point about. Maybe he should stick to writing about airplanes. But a lot of the time, like, the death punishment is like you lose some gold, or you have to backtrack and get your gear, or whatever. And it's like very interesting to me that the punishment of death is almost always monetary.
Yeah. I
guess because they know that, gold is cheap.
Yeah. But of course, roguelikes are sort of it's either like they eliminate the repetitiveness that comes with death in games, right? You don't have to do the exact same thing again, right? If you got stuck on something, congrats. It's not there anymore. Right? Or in the case of more casual ones, when you die, it offers chances to unlock more permanent progression of things. So in fact, in Hades, when you die, it's like, well, okay, I can go upgrade the mirror, or get a new keepsake from someone I haven't given nectar yet, or all these various different things that you can use to change your character, but it's permanent and, like, in terms of offering more choices for your run-throughs. And there's other, that's just like a feature of roguelites, I guess, too, is just, there is something desirable in death, right? Because you get to come back stronger the next time, literally.
Well, first of all, is Mario a roguelike? Second.
No.
Why not?
I don't know.
It's not randomly generated. But it's all very Buddhist. This is what I was thinking. This is what I think about sometimes, and I have thought about. And there was a great article, mostly not about, like, death in games, and more about what this group of Thai Buddhist monks who do, like, free English chats to practice their English every day, like, think about games in general. In case you're wondering, somewhere between a half an hour and an hour of games a day is okay. But beyond that, it's probably going to get in the way of your studies.
Probably, yeah.
And they're not supposed to play sports games, because sports are not allowed. Promotes attachment.
What do they think about Overwatch?
Well, they were not asked directly about Overwatch.
League of Legends.
Now, to be clear, they were not against violence in games. They were like, this is not a living thing.
I meant more in terms of, are they just not allowed to play FIFA? What do they think about esports?
Unclear. If only Robert Rath had thought in 2018 to ask them a little bit more about esports, but he did not. But if you're getting too into it, if it's promoting attachment, it's bad. So probably those games are not good, because you'd probably have to get too into it. But they did talk a little bit, like he talked about how he felt like respawning in these kinds of games mirrors the Buddhist cycle, right? Because, you die and you get reborn, but you retain the knowledge, right? Like you, the player, at the very least, if not in the roguelite sense of continuing to, build up your skills. And the monks he was talking to seemed to feel like, yeah, like that's legit. That holds water. So there you have it.
Cool monks.
Roguelites are basically Buddhism.
Well, I do think that, roguelikes are equipped to talk about the actual death of a failure state more than a lot of games, right? I read one blog post by Emma Kostopoulos that was sort of talking about the differing perspectives that Returnal and Hades take on death. With Returnal being more of a horror game and really leaning into like the sort of horror of death, and it's a game also about grieving a death that has already happened, right? And the fear of what comes after death, right? It's talking about all those things. Whereas Hades is very much more sort of death positive in a sense, in terms of like it's a natural cycle of life. And in fact, for something like for Zagreus, it's just his job. It's a part of life, right? It's literally a part of his life. And sort of comparing like these different thoughts on death as ways of reckoning with our own perspective on death, right? Both confronting its fear and recognizing its mundanity in the general cycle of life. And it's able to do that because death is like actually something that happens and carries forward throughout the game, as opposed to just setting you back like it didn't happen.
Yeah, and that's built into the mechanics and the feeling of playing both of those two games, right? Hades kind of rewards you for dying, or sets you up in a situation to provide rewards for you when you die, both narrative crumbs and skill progression. Returnal is just like, you cannot save, and this game is long.
You can save now.
You are going to feel horrified when you die.
You can save now.
I know you can save now, but like the original creative vision.
There was one very funny comment. I watched a game developer's toolbox video on designing death, and the first comment was like, what do you mean it's meaningless when you die in Stalker? You have to face that really long loading screen. It's horrifying. It's so scary that you might have to face the loading screen. Which is very funny. There's some punishment that's baked into dying, especially in older games. That's perhaps a bit of on a meta level.
Yeah. Well, I do want to talk a little bit about the sort of like recent trend of death positive, or I don't know, death highly realistic games. Two branches, right?
Sure.
So I think that the poster child for some of this is stuff like Spiritfarer, stuff like Mortician's Tale. There's a whole subgenre of games that's like caring for the dead and dying. Even Cozy Grove is sort of this, right? Yeah. A lot of kind of management and life sim caring for the death and dying, which is really interesting to me. And a lot of writing about those from like death positive organizations, which was interesting to encounter. and ways in which those push back against, you know, the narrative of the kind of like meaninglessness of video game death, but also that push back against, obviously in Western culture, we are deeply uncomfortable with death, or deeply, it's not very visible in Western culture in a way that some different cultures, not that anyone is like comfortable with death, right?
Sure.
But we want it to be sanitized and invisible in Western culture in a way that not all cultures necessarily stick with. And so yeah, an organization, I read a lot from, what is this organization actually called? It can't be Good Death English CamAC.uk. From A Good Death, which is a website. It's run by the University of Cambridge, sort of an English department subsite, where yeah, they talked about how, you know, that the trivialization of death in video games is actually like really in line with how we, you know, not the trivialization exactly, but the invisibleness of it, the sort of like it's something that must be overcome, is very in line with how we talk about people who are battling, right, terminal illness, or, you know, like the kind of sanitization of that process. So in some ways it's like very unrealistic, in other ways it is very culturally reflective.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. There's definitely some, you know, they mention What Remains of Edith Finch on here, and I'm not sure I would call that like a death positive game.
Yeah.
But it is certainly more sort of unflinching in its various depictions of death, in that each sort of encounter you have with the different family members requires you to go through, abstracted, but go through their to their death, essentially, the stages that led them there, and sort of look at it and see it and then, you know, return to the present in which they are dead. So there's that as well. But that's not quite the same thing as like Spiritfarer's like genuine like caring for someone until they pass on, which is both in like, I'm pretty sure it's implied that her name's Stella, right? Your character. Yeah. I'm pretty sure it's implied that Stella was like an elderly caretaker before her own death, and now she's sort of doing the same thing for dead spirits in the afterlife.
It is. You know, there's To the Moon. It was interesting to me to be like, that's so interesting that there is a whole subgenre of games that is like caring for the dead and dying and for spirits. It's interesting. But then of course there's also a whole subgenre of games that are like about grief, right? And that's probably its own podcast, but like Tales of Kanzara that we talked about last week is this. Greece is this. There's a whole list of games that are about like characters going on a journey to confront their feelings about death, sure. Basically. So all sorts of things, and all sorts of things that we won't have time to dive deep into in one podcast, but maybe in a future podcast. It was interesting to me also how often, I mean, there's so little major character death in games, and then death in games, when it does happen, is often so divorced from the interactivity of it as a player. I would be interested in seeing more creative takes on like someone or something dies and the way you interact with the game changes. Yeah. Edith Finch plays around with control scheme when you're playing as different characters to kind of make it to simulate that unfamiliarity. I read about a game on this blog called Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons, wherein throughout the game you're controlling one brother with one side of the controller and another brother with the other side of the controller, and then when, spoiler, one of them dies, just like that side of your controller doesn't do anything anymore, which I thought was very powerful.
That was Joseph Ferris's first big game.
Of course.
It's very a precursor to the actual co-op stuff.
But I would be remiss if I didn't bring up Talk This. Mainstay game series. Kingdom Hearts. Can people die in Kingdom Hearts?
Yes.
How?
I think in Kingdom Hearts 3 we did in fact experience death.
Did we?
For other characters and for our character.
Why aren't more games utilizing the PlayStation speaker when you die?
If you know what, if I was dying in real life, okay, and I heard Goofy tell me not to give up, I would stop dying. It'd be as simple as that.
Plain and simple.
The real Goofy, I feel like I should say. You can't bring in like an impersonator. I need the real Goofy to call out to me in my heart and tell me not to give up.
That's what Kingdom Hearts is raising the possibility that the afterlife is the real world, right? Like, just complicated death storytelling happening there.
Sure. You know, death is not always just, the death of a living being, right? There's the death of it plays a lot with the death of, like, identity, I feel like, in Kingdom Hearts, you know?
Sure.
The death of your surrounding context, you know? The death of your understanding of the world.
And maybe, God willing, one day, the death of Mickey Mouse.
We all hope.
So, there's just so much that could be dug into and so many different angles to talk about death in games. But Emma, do you have anything else you want to make sure we don't miss before we hit the end of the episode here?
I get the, even when I'm watching like TV shows and movies and stuff, I totally get the impulse. Like you said earlier, like we want the stakes to be high. But I'm always like, that doesn't mean, right? Like death does not have to be the highest stakes that you can offer, right? If you're just because characters aren't dying does not necessarily mean you can't be playing with high stakes. And I feel like because it's so common, you might fall back on that as an idea of what to do to make your story higher stakes. And I want you to stop. It's
certainly the easiest way. Yeah.
I want you to stop and really think about it. Now, I'm not saying don't kill characters or don't, incorporate death into your story if you're like, yeah, no, this is correct, right? But consider your death. Consider the act of writing death in, right? And what is that actually doing for the experience that you're trying to create? I guess that's my hot take as someone who enjoys death. I guess. I don't know.
I think Emma wants to see more impactful major character death.
Yeah, Michael Mouse. Like we said.
Michael Mouse. Your days are numbered.
Goofy will not call out to you when you die. He will not. You left Goofy for dead once before, and he will do the same for you.
God, remember that? Remember when it looked like for a moment like Kingdom Hearts 2 had killed Goofy?
We'd be living... I can't say we'd be living in a better world, but we would be living in a completely different world, I think.
The culture would have shifted. Like, who knows what our media landscape would look... Who knows what our world would look like had Goofy been killed in cold blood like 1/3 of the way into Kingdom Hearts 2.
Yeah.
It's hard to even imagine.
It's really hard to imagine.
It is.
One of those pivotal branches of history.
I certainly have to agree. Hey, circling back one more time then to Mario to close things out. Should he die?
I don't think he can. I think Mario is more like a collective of beings,
Okay.
right? He's like he's like Link, right?
Right, okay.
There's always a Mario. And he will always be jumping.
That's really dark what you're proposing here.
Is it?
By the way.
Why?
Because that's like like he is dying, but there's just a new like it's like Amazon, like mega corporation of plumbers.
I mean, he did so many drugs in Super Mario Wonder. So, you know, it's hard on his health.
Emma's saying he deserved it.
I'm not. Just
Should
saying.
have jumped a little more carefully.
He parties so much with his friends, you know.
You're right. And enemies.
And enemies. He parties so much with his enemies.
He's a reckless driver. Driving on mushrooms.
Yeah.
Well, on that
just be more
like,
careful
very
with
dark,
himself.
the moment you think about it note. When will we get a Mario Souls like? Okay, anyway, on that note.
Have you seen the thing that Nintendo has been teasing? The, like, Who is Emio? Scary ghost rated M thing that they're teasing on their official account?
No!
Well, you can look into it.
Mario Souls? Really?
I don't know if it's really Mario. I think it's a new
crazy.
thing, but they're expanding, so I wouldn't put Mario Dark Souls past them, to be honest.
Mario does not... Something about the character design of Mario does not strike me as someone who could dodge precisely.
Well,
Like the idea of
Waluigi
that.
Dark Souls.
Waluigi Dark Souls? Is that what you just said?
Yeah. That's why he can't be in Smash. He's busy.
Wow. All right. Well, with that free note, listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
Do you have a most impactful video game death? Don't say the one. Like, I recognize that she's the only character who's ever died in the history of gaming, but...
It's so true.
Like, don't. Do you think that, do you have ideas about Mario's immortal soul? Do you wish that, more games did Prince of Persia style workarounds? Are there other death positive games that we didn't talk about? The answer is yes. If you have thoughts on this or anything else we talked about this week, hit us up on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games in the hat, and read our blog, featuring long-running series Clickbait Boyfriend and Split Screen. But most importantly, if you enjoy the show, you ought to subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Podcasts, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, wherever you can find podcasts. Like and subscribe to Talk This. Next week, I don't remember the games at all.
Next week, we are talking about Injustice, Gods Among Us. Sorry, I just said Among Us and then had a gamer moment inside my brain. Sorry.
Man, there's a game where there's some death. We didn't talk about Among Us.
You're right.
All.
We didn't talk about. There's death games. There's murder mystery games. Right.
I thought about talking about Return to the Obra Dinn, and then I was like, that feels like a whole separate thing.
Yeah, it kind of is. I had an epiphany over this that The World Ends With You is a death game, which I guess makes sense, but I just hadn't classified it as that before. So, there you go. And then our new game is Unicorn Overlord.
Right. So look forward to that. And then in 2 weeks, what have we been playing?
Yeah. Look forward to it.
Well, that's it for this week's show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Emma, send us off.
Listeners, this week, I hope that you live.